Well, I'm happy to get a chance to be back today, guys. We thought this would be an interesting opportunity for us to have a conversation about some of the things we talked a little bit about yesterday, how AI is impacting cyber threats, especially advanced persistent threats. Also bringing CrowdStrike to be a part of the conversation, and Cristian specifically with his experience too as well. I've been at CrowdStrike 11 years.
Yeah, going on 11 years, yeah.
So a lot of experience in their space with their products, but going all the way back, and a lot of people aren't familiar necessarily these days that CrowdStrike actually started really as a threat intelligence company. And before there was even just the endpoint itself and what is now really the leading EDR product, there was an obsessive focus on threat actor tracking, and it's still something that I truly believe they're one of the best, if not the best at in the world. Again, that's hence the comments yesterday about going to check out. Well, we will just use the acronym you hear us say GTR today. We're talking about the Global Threat Report that they release every year, and that I told everybody to go download and read. I hope some of you guys did that. We're going to talk a little more in depth about some of the findings in the GTR, what that means from an industry perspective, share maybe a little bit of war stories and stories from the trenches, the things that we're both seeing in our world. But just for clarity, this is due to coast-to-coast travel schedules and the fun that often comes with some of those events. Some of you may have experienced that with ground stop delays and other things that happened in Newark this week. We have not had a chance to rehearse this conversation. So we're going to wing it a little bit here for you guys, and then we'll give you guys an opportunity probably to ask some questions. We'll get some mics around the room and open up the conversation for your engagement, not necessarily for a stump the chump kind of question, but we do want to have real conversation and willing to take on some of the challenging questions about how we're responding, what to do, or even things you're thinking about and how this impacts your businesses too as well.
No, absolutely. Looking forward to it. I also want to apologize for the midlife crisis hairstyle that you see in the profile picture. So we'll talk about that off camera. But yeah, let's get into it.
So there's some really interesting things happening in the world. We talked about yesterday, what a jailbroken large language model can do and how that can be used to weaponize AI for the attackers. The GTR is talking a lot about this these days, and specifically, there's some I think really impactful metrics that have changed. In our industry, and there's certain things that we use to kind of measure the effectiveness of persistent threats and attackers, what they're doing, and even how we should then measure the effectiveness of our programs. One of them is a term we use called breakout time. Right. And so breakout time, for those of you not familiar in the room, is essentially the time it takes for an attacker to go from compromising one endpoint in your environment, which is something that we all have to accept is going to happen. Right? It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when endpoints are compromised in your environment. Those things happen. But then what is the time it takes for the attacker to get to that one endpoint and then break out laterally to multiple other endpoints in your environment or establish some more prolific enterprise compromise at some point? There's some changes in that data that I thought were really relevant to talk through.
We started tracking this metric in roughly 2016. We published a global threat report, which is basically our observations of the attack tradecraft that we've been seeing the year before. And the average time when we first published this was 4 hours, anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours. So adversary would get land on a system, and it would take them a while to actually break out of that and move laterally in some capacity. And so we went from this 4 to 8 hour average, each of those timing, metrics being even applicable. You can almost tie it to different groups based upon the resources they have. So nation state versus e-crime versus like a hacktivist group. But now we're seeing, like 48 minutes as an average time, right? Which is astounding. With the fastest breakout time was 51 seconds. So think of that, right? Like, anyone have a French press, right? It's a long process to make that coffee, by the way, right? And an adversary can basically get into an environment, move laterally within 51 seconds, and I'm still watching that one bean float down. That I'm like, man, he's a fighter. And so it's interesting to see that adversaries they're becoming efficient, right? We're seeing that AI is enabling them, and it's basically also lowering that bar for even someone that isn't acclimated with offensive security or even counterintelligence tools to basically leverage AI to expedite that process of moving laterally or even establishing a foothold on a system. Right? And there's so many different techniques we've observed, in these processes. One of them being also the amount of or the increase in vishing, right? Or basically an adversary picking up the phone and calling your help desk under the guise of an employee that is in duress, right, trying to reset their password. Or even the inverse of that. We talked about this last year, where Scattered Spider, even called up an employee acting like there's someone from the help desk saying, hey, it looks like you're getting a bunch of MFA bombing, a bunch of requests to authenticate into your VPN via your MFA tool. I know your kid's soccer game probably we're having a problem with their VPN. Do you mind just hitting yes on the next prompt, and your problem's going to go away? And your employees and the end users who are none the wiser are going to respond to that, right? Especially there's a lot of emotional and cognitive bias that these adversaries are taking advantage of, and they're also using AI to help them understand their targets really, really well and effectively. And the vishing and these calls they're effective, right? Because Kevin Mitnick style, right? Like just social engineer your way into an environment, and it's a lot easier than trying to like you watch an episode of 24, right? And someone's like, yeah, I need to hack into the firewall, and they smash on the keyboard for like 10 seconds. They're like, I'm in, right? Like, I mean, that was clearly, that's not real, but
and using that as the reference for how hacking works is the biggest way to get a pet peeve for a cybersecurity guy. We use the term military grade firewalls.
Exactly.
That just means for those of us from that world that it was built by the lowest bidder. Right? So
Exactly.
the worst term for actual security there, but you're right.
Exactly, right? Like HACK, boom, I'm in. And so we find it's interesting that adversaries are increasing their social engineering attempts via these phishing, but then there's this interesting tradecraft that we just published in the GTR, and it's along the same lines where an adversary is now targeting victims, and they're using even AI to do basically subscription bombing, right? So think of this, like you're getting all of a sudden a massive influx of emails from Scandinavian knitting and cat samples, right? Cat food samples, who named it, right? You name it. And all of a sudden you're like 3,000 emails in your inbox, and you're like, what is going on? And then you get a phone call that afternoon, and it's someone from IT, and they're like, hey, are you getting a bunch of spam? And you're like, yes, I am, right? And they go, hey, you know what? Let me remote onto your machine and let me fix this for you. And that's basically the adversary, again, acting under the guise of a help desk analyst saying, I'm going to get rid of your problem. And your employees are emotional, right? Again, they're like, yeah, I'm frustrated. Yes, help me. And they're allowing these adversaries to get onto these systems, put whatever tool, usually it's a remote management tool that is outside of what an organization is standardized on. And then they're getting onto these systems, and they're dumping creds, or they're staying very persistent. And I mean, it's pretty asinine, the amount of attempts and successful attempts that have been made where an adversary should just simply call up a victim and get onto that environment pretty quickly, right? With very little resistance, right?
And now as we see that begin to evolve too, right? That the true human interaction components that are happening, and that's become more and more effective for attackers now. We talk about that record breakout time really of 51 seconds, which is staggering, right? And even 48 minutes is kind of earth-shattering even for the cybersecurity industry. As a lot of us, and myself, coming from an MDR provider, right, where we had a contractual SLA for mean time to response. That's how, as providers or defenders, we'll often measure how effective we are. Or what's the time it takes us to respond to an event that's happened in your environment? And if your security operations center folks, your cyber folks, aren't measuring that in your environment, great KPI to implement. What does it take for us to respond on a time basis to an event, and then by priority?
Absolutely.
Right? And contractually, we would say, hey, we're going to respond to them within 60 minutes. And this is the first time that we've ever seen the average breakout time move below that line that's been the industry standard for what's the timeline we need to respond to make sure we don't go from compromise to breach. Right. And that's been a key. So now we're having to think and adjust about how this changes the industry for us too as well. So, some of the things that impact this now too as well, we're talking about phishing, we're talking about that human interaction component. I talked yesterday, you guys, about like that movement closer to revenue. How do we get away from the more technical steps and simply get money out of accounts or access straight to systems? The human is one of the best ways to do this.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about how now deepfakes, both voice and even video, now come into play to get that human interaction done at scale, getting past the language barriers, both written and vocal, in that too as well.
I think we're seeing, right, when Gen AI was kind of first released, it was kind of mind blowing, right? I mean, anyone have a mom or parent that calls them and asks them about, like my mom just got an Instagram, which is like I'm fearful for, and I had to spend an hour last week explaining the concept of a hashtag to her, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is gonna, like, I don't even want her touching ChatGPT, right? But we're seeing that as these technologies become more accessible, and people become more power users, because I think we're right now at a point where maybe 10% real power user usage of Gen AI tools that are out there. I think the adversaries are way past that, right? I mean, the adversaries have weaponized AI in so many ways, and there's tons of ways to jailbreak these models. I'm sure you spoke about that. You said yesterday. But then there's also a variety of large language models that are in the dark web, right? And so there's like Worm GPT, for example, right, where these adversaries are using these tools to weaponize their tradecraft, and then they get access to cloud infrastructure that's compromised, and they may spin up services to start running these models on, and then they start to weaponize that for things like vishing, or disguising their voices, or deepfake video conferencing. So Scatterspider is a really good example of that, where again, a group that has been prolific on using social engineering techniques and calling up and even hiding their voices behind some type of AI model, right? That is becoming pretty prevalent. And I fear that. I mentioned my mom because I fear the day where my mom gets a call from me, right, saying that I need her to wire me some money because I'm like, we've seen the phishing emails in the past, right? Where, hey, I'm stuck in this country. Can you send me $5,000 at Western Union or something like that, right? And then, people used to fall for that. I don't know if it still happens, but the elderly were historically kind of targeted because they were none the wiser, right? But if you got a phone call, your guard is dropping significantly, and it really goes into a really big psychological, aspect that adversaries are exploiting on the human element, as you mentioned. Because if I can take advantage of an emotional response, right, I'm going to get the most emotional response from you if I can talk to you, right, and if I can work my way into a conversation and convince you. And so I think that's where we'll see adversaries. You don't need a ton of compute for that, right? And for the voice stuff, the video a little more, but still it's pretty easy. We've done some testing here at CrowdStrike where we had Sean Henry. If you know who Sean Henry is, he's former FBI, used to be the chief security officer at CrowdStrike, and we had him get on a session with a video where he looked like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, right? And so and they're both bald, right? And I don't know if that's it is what it is. And so it's like, wow, it was his voice, but it's like, wow, that's really cool that with the very little compute that we handed this model, he looked just like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and he kind of was talking to CrowdStrike, and I thought it was kind of a cool trick. But if an adversary uses their compute power and their access to resources, especially if we're talking nation states, think about how much more we'll start to see that. We also, we ourselves here at CrowdStrike, we built a model last year to actually do voice analysis. So Scatterspider, again, phishing campaigns, all over hundreds of victims. We got access to hundreds of hours of voice recordings. And we actually ran that through these models that we built. And what's really great about that is out of the hundreds of hours of phone calls that we analyzed, where they're calling in help desk or acting to be, pretending to be someone from the help desk, we actually distinguished that there's 7 unique voices that were tied to this group, right? Out of hundreds of models. And we built a model that said, hey, let's actually intercept phone calls and in real time identify if a member from Scatterspider is calling an organization. And it had between 84 to 92% success rate in terms of accuracy, that if that voice was found on an actual live phone call, we can identify that moving forward. So we anticipate that AI, outside of it being weaponized, there's so many great use cases that the good guys can leverage. And even identifying in real time an adversary, I think, in terms of social engineering techniques is going to be another tool or quiver, right, that you have access to for defending against these attacks.
So. We heard Microsoft talk about that a little bit yesterday, talking about having NPUs on the desktop. You just heard Qualcomm talking about that, and even the application of security now too as well. One of the fundamental principles of security, both as a defender or as an attacker, is violations of trust. Right? You hear about the principles of zero trust, and one of the ways you get around the technical aspects of trust is to then exploit that from a human factor.
Absolutely.
And so you're talking about the emotional response. And when you then bring into now not only getting a phone call, but let's say getting a video call from someone you know. Right. And so it's their face, it's their voice, and it looks like it's coming from them. And they're asking you to do something that would then compromise the security configuration of an environment. This is a real world scenario that we have to start thinking about today. And now that brings us to that evolution of, okay, now how do we detect, defend, and take the next steps against that, right? Having the NPUs and the endpoint, having NPU-enabled desktops becomes really important.
Exactly.
We talked about that the tie between the end user compute and security, and how you can't build an end user compute strategy anymore for your environment without thinking about the future of security and what's going to be needed to secure against the threats that are coming, not just now, but in the next generation of things that are happening with the advent of AI, with how that's impacting the environment. Because the toolkits that we're seeing, I was talking with our CISO at SHI yesterday about this, Chris Sulo. We were talking about Xantharox, which is kind of the number one AI hackers toolkit that's being run on the dark web. Like you talked about, they're hosting their own cloud infrastructure, running their own language models, training these models to do attacker activity. And we looked at one that was jailbroken yesterday on how it would identify a social engineering campaign specifically to target my company, to target us. Right. And it did a great job at that, identified some of my leadership changes, my arrival to the business 6 months ago, like all these things, and said, here's how we build a targeted campaign to go after these new hires from the new leader of the business. And it gave great examples. And it's like, wow, now imagine what a language model built for that can do. And I don't mean to sound like excited about the capabilities of that. We're geeks and we get excited about dissecting and taking this stuff apart. So excuse us on that. But these tools, like there's a significant level of R&D and capability and frankly talent that exists out there that's going into this now that impacts everything that's happening. And so, when we look at that from the attacker perspective, let's talk a little bit about now from the defender perspective. How do we use LLMs? You guys really, I think, are leading the way in implementing kind of an AI-based platform, implementing, if you guys haven't heard, CrowdStrike has released AI into their platform they call Charlotte. It kind of integrates into all the different layers and the different modules in CrowdStrike right now to begin to build the capabilities to counter this. And even, as Cristian talked about, building a model that worked on the endpoint to live detect, this is a deep fake voice that is on this. One of the 7 voices from Scattered Spider, and detecting that live. These are the capabilities that we need to go now. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing with Charlotte.
So Charlotte, it's interesting. When Charlotte first came out, we had this vision, we had this long-term vision where the technology, the platform of CrowdStrike would have this assistant where it can kind of guide you into how to respond to a threat across a variety of different attack points. So including the endpoint, the identities, what we see in the cloud, even from a third-party perspective. And we basically started out with this model that was very much an assistant, right? So ask it a question, get a response, ask it for help, it gives you the help. But what we've done with this model is we've basically started moving into more agentic capabilities, where there's a reasoning capability that's built on top of the platform. There's the gentleman that was speaking earlier from Qualcomm mentioned RAG. Like, we've implemented RAG in our world because there's a lot of data that we capture. We're analyzing over 2 trillion events every single day. Because of that, you don't ever want to simply just throw a model on top of the large data set. It's subject to hallucinations or giving you responses that aren't necessarily accurate. Really, in our world, we are focused on using RAG to actually then call the different capabilities in the platform. And basically, we train this model to understand what is a threat, how did CrowdStrike respond to these threats. So we have our own human group called Complete. And so it's an MDR service where we do everything from removal of persistence, and we're walking through what an attacker has to do in order to stay persistent, to get access to the system, extortion campaigns, exfiltration campaigns, ransomware, so forth. So we train these models on understanding what does a bad guy do, what does a good guy do to remediate, and then we've built it into the platform to do real-time reasoning to say, oh, I see this happening in the platform. Now these are responses that I can do on your behalf, right? And then also we're using AI. And we'll announce this at RSA, so I'm giving you a little bit of a preview. By the way, if anyone going to RSA out here, raise your hands. Not one soul. Oh, one soul. There we go. All right. My apologies.
I need to rethink my attendance, apparently.
So, and if you are out there, just act surprised when you hear this. It's like, what? That's amazing. So we're announcing this at RSA, but think of this concept where these models are prompt engines, right? So you ask it a question, use natural language, you get a response. So think of you building this response workflow by simply asking the model to do it. To say, anytime I see a detection that maps to ransomware or data exfiltration, or if I see an event that's tied to someone dumping credentials, right? This is what I want you to do. You're just telling the model, like, send an executive report to my CISO, send me a detailed technical analysis to my SOC lead, and send me, the IOCs to my detection engineering team because I want them to review that, inclusive of also any third-party tools that were part of that. And you're simply just asking the model for that. You're just using language, English or whatever language that you want, and then it basically builds out this entire orchestration flow, and it sits in the platform on your behalf. And if it cannot find the data in order to build the report for you within the structured or the parameters that you've defined, it will then also expand itself and say, by the way, if you want me to, I can also go into, if you're sending me firewall logs, I'll look in there as well. Or if you're sending me application logs, I'll look in there as well. And you just let me know what you want me to do. And so the reasoning capability, or the ability to be dynamic with the threat defender, is really where we're taking the platform, where it's more than just having to ask a question and get an answer. It's basically defining an objective. I want to reduce my risk, and here's what I need to do, and this is what my environment looks like. And because we're collecting all of this high fidelity telemetry on the endpoints and in your cloud and on the identity side, right? And we can ingest it from third-party tools where you cannot put the sensor, for example. We have that ability to start creating these reasoning models across those data sets. And that, quite frankly, is going to be game-changing for how defenders can keep up with stats like 48 minutes on breakout time.
Exactly, right? And so this is the evolution that has to begin to happen. And even as IT organizations, that we have to begin thinking through of how we're going to have this implemented into our technology, and how our users are going to use it. So there's two factors that we want to be looking at that you should be thinking about when you hear people talking about how they're going to integrate GPT, large language models, AI, whatever the marketing term that they come with to you to talk about it is, right? How they're integrating that into your security technology stack. There's how efficacious we are and how efficient we are, right? And so when we look at that from an efficiency perspective, it's how does this speed us up? How does this make the response faster? How does this improve, our mean time to response so that dwell time goes down and we don't cross over that average breakout time threshold, right? We're preventing compromise to breach using AI to cut the timeline down and make us better at what we do, right? But then also, how do we then elevate the skill level that of people that are doing this? Some of you probably run into this problem that we see across the entire security industry that I have to deal with all the time too as well, and that there's not enough talented security people out there.
That's a challenge,
right? And we're all dealing with that. It's an industry-wide problem, is that we are underserved with fully qualified security people that exist in the world today. And if you're in cybersecurity, it's great for your job security, but it's not necessarily great for us doing a great job of stopping the attackers across the world. But if you can take someone that maybe even exists in the support structure of your organization, and their desktop support, and they're in the CrowdStrike console, they're in an LLM-enabled security console, and they can say, I've got this security event, help me understand it. What should the next steps be? And the platform can say, hey, this event means the following things have happened on the endpoint. You should run these two queries. Here's the query, here's where you should run it, here's how to run it, or even go run it for you and return the result. I went and ran these two queries, also to show you other endpoints already affected by this. Take these steps, go click that button, click this button, isolate it. Like, that's the level of workflow and enablement that we're getting to, that we're lowering the threshold of skill required to get effective response using large language model, and speeding up our ability to get those responses in place to stop the attackers too.
I couldn't have said it better.
But even with those technology improvements, what we also were talking about yesterday is how important it is to still just be great at the fundamentals.
Agreed.
Right? We see that SDLC speeding up. We see the capability speeding up. Talk a little bit about how important it is to still do tabletops today and walk through the basics and the fundamentals.
I mean, tabletops are just so important. I made this, I talked about this a few years ago at a conference in Miami, and I was making this kind of like analogy. And anyone watch The Office, basically, right? So, The Office, there's this episode of The Office where Dwight Schrute, emulates a fire, right? And basically there's like chaos ensues because no one knows what to do. And like, I think someone falls out of the ceiling, there's a cat that gets thrown through a roof, and people are trying to exit doors that aren't necessarily the right exit doors. And it's just pandemonium. And I basically said, like, you should treat things like tabletop exercise like that, right? Like, understand, like, how do you respond to an active adversary that is in your environment, either through social engineering, or if you've gone into a ransomware, event, or whatever the case may be. I think practicing, like, breaking that glass and that concept, and just walking through, are the right people involved? Do you have the right legal? Do you have your retainers for the right third-party people, folks involved? I mean, going through that I think is so important. Even if it's ugly in the beginning, you're not going to get better unless you actually see how bad it truly is. And so we're very big advocates for tabletop exercises, doing things like compromise assessments. You know, there's red teaming services that we offer now that do focus, by the way, not to make this a sales pitch, but really more focus on like, is your organization adopting AI? Because we do see, you know, there's ChatGPT usage naturally. No one wants their employees to inadvertently put sensitive data into something like ChatGPT. And then, you know, there's lots of companies that are building their own custom large language models for, you know, to do exactly what Gen AI is supposed to do, right? The Gen and Gen AI is like generative AI. You're trying to generate something new, and there's so many use cases where you'll have, you know, folks in pharma, right, that will feed these models all of this telemetry based upon medications that they've developed or that haven't been made public, and they're using these models to develop new medications, right? And I mean, it's quite fascinating how much they've expedited that research process using large language models and these big data science models and neural networks. The same thing also applies to, I mean, you name the industry, right? We've seen it in the healthcare side, right? We've seen it, you know, by putting all these symptoms and the results of these medical trials, right? They all go into these custom large language models, and oftentimes we're seeing organizations adopt these models. They give it to their DevOps team. Their DevOps teams they run with it, but they're commingling data now, right? They're taking IP and they're taking sensitive data, and they're basically using data that's unclassified. They're putting it into this system, and if they don't have the right controls around that system, right, now they have opportunities for that data to be exposed inadvertently by someone getting onto that model, asking a question, exfiltrating the data, and you know, it's out the door. And so we're big advocates for understanding what is your footprint look like from an AI perspective, and then how do you put guardrails around that as well?
Yeah. So, you know, and we talk about having like great use cases for AI. I think you made a great statement here about tabletops. I'm going to lean into that a little bit. Like, don't be afraid of the ugly score on your tabletop, right? Like it's actually great. Like as a business leader, one of the things I'm always looking at, I'm talking to my leadership team about, is we want to be looking at leading indicators, not lagging indicators in the KPIs for our business, right? So obviously, as a sales business, my team has a sales quota. I don't want to wait till the end of the quarter to see if we made the numbers or not. What do I want to look at ahead of time? I want to be looking at pipeline developed week over week, because that's going to be an indicator of whether I'm probably going to get to numbers. Well, they're these same leading indicators that we can look at in security that will help us know before a compromise happens how well our team will actually respond. Yeah. And one of those is how well you can run a tabletop in your environment. Don't expect it to be great if you've never done it before. But here's a great use case for an LLM for you. Go to ChatGPT, Grok, or whatever your preferred platform is. If you're locked down and you've only got Copilot, it also can still do this really, really well. And ask it to develop a tabletop scenario for you. Now, you don't have to be an expert. It will help develop the scenario, the outputs, the way to score it. It will even walk you through the steps and then give you great remediations to do based on the output of that for you. This is a great use case for using a LLM in your environment. But go run the tabletop. We talked yesterday, like you can do this without external cost, and it's going to give you a ton of value to your organization to help figure out if you are ready for the kind of things that are happening right now, how much help you actually need. But go to the LLM and ask it the simple question: help me develop a good incident response tabletop exercise using modern applications of cybersecurity attacks today. Yeah. And it will give you a full write-out of how to do this scenario, and go use that with your team. Walk through the steps. If you're not in a position to make that change, have it print that out and bring it to your leader. Bring it to your CISO or your CIO and say, I think this is really important for us to do today.
Yeah, absolutely. You define your industry as well, too, right? Say, I'm in this industry. Walk me through a tabletop exercise that's going to be very fitting, right? Given the top security concerns and risks that are applicable to the industry that I'm in. That also helps kind of expedite, you know, that write-up for you, right? I'd say embrace it, right? Anyone fearful of AI? Not like in the Terminator way, but, you know, like in the
maybe a little bit.
A little bit, right? Yeah, I was just asking a few folks recently, and, you know, I was in a conference last week, and there was a group of people that were like, yeah, I'm actually concerned around AI taking my job. Like South Park, like they took our jobs, right? You know, like, which I thought was very interesting, because the objective in our world especially is to have AI augment the defender, right? And make you better and faster versus replace you. I don't think we're at the point where we'll have like full replacement. We use, again, there's a very big human component to the way that we train our AI models as well, right? We have to you have to train the model, right? This is what a human does in an effort to mitigate this risk. And here's what happens in order to triage. And, you know, that MTTR, MTTD score is based upon a lot of human interaction. The models are learning from that. And so I would say, embrace it, right? Use it for good. Don't go to the dark side. But there's a lot of really great use cases that can help you and augment you.
Yeah, agreed. Well, we've got just a few minutes left here, and we actually wanted to open it up for questions to the audience. So I think we have
some
mic runners who are ready to bring them around. I see Anne-Marie back there with the mic. If you have a question, we'll see another one back here too as well. Great. Please feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring a mic over. Everything's fair game. I see one over there, the hand up.
Hey guys.
I don't know where it's coming from.
Trying to find.
I see.
Oh,
Yeah,
back there.
Okay.
You guys do a lot of work on training models and trying to detect deep fakes and voice and so on. I might be a bit behind on the latest news, but when is that coming to me as a user running the CrowdStrike agent on my machine, joining a Teams call? My CISO pulls us in on a Saturday morning, say, hey, I'm working with CrowdStrike, something happened on the network. Can you just step up to global admin and just create us an API and just email it to me?
Sure.
So we all worry about the end user and the poor secretary that's trying to do something, but what about the admin team that that I've got credentials, or that, hey, these are the bunch of guys that will participate in a, let's say, quote unquote breach. So let's try and fake something there. And more so, not only like when I join a Teams call or a Zoom call, my CrowdStrike agent starts popping up and say something's weird here. One of these participants aren't really them. Or more so, what happens if I run the Teams app on my phone and now I just get a normal call? It's already integrated into my desk, that type of stuff. So I would like to know what you guys do in that space.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'm sorry, I can't see them literally.
The lights right in the eyes right there.
So I think we are a data company, right? We've always been a data company. We learn how to defend against threats because of the amount of data that we're collecting, and naturally, the more that we widen the aperture of our capabilities, the more data we can see. And so doing things like behavioral analysis based upon who's logging onto the Teams, or even API integration into third-party tools like Teams or Zoom, or you name the vendor, we have built our platform. Especially, there was an acquisition we made of a company called Humio not long ago. And the objective of that acquisition was to allow our platform to scale beyond all of the first-party capabilities that we support natively with our technology. And that means that if you want to send us logs and stream logs in real time from the likes of a web conference provider or any third-party tool, we'll be able to then add some type of model to that and start to look for things like outliers. Like, hey, we're getting on a Teams session on Saturday. Not really a big thing. That happens all the time, right? But if someone is now saying, hey, we saw authentication, or we saw authorization to this web app, and all of a sudden we see these entitlements changing, and someone is getting API access with this. That was an acquisition of a company we made, Adaptive Shield, right, which is now on our platform. Now, outside of the authentication, now we can get access to authorization concepts, right? And say, now someone's trying to access these applications via API, or we're seeing these programmatic requests come up that we haven't historically seen before. And so I think that really lends itself to saying, well, we do all this great stuff on the endpoint, identity in the cloud. What else can we start to get our arms around? And cloud and SASE is going to be and is a very big part of that. And then as we start to get into more AI-specific use cases like deepfake and vishing, a lot of that is going to be contingent on understanding how do we impact the endpoint, and then how do we leverage and tap into like NPU frameworks as well. And so there's a lot that's going on in the background, and there's a lot that we have expended on for third-party support as well. Right?
Yeah, I think the timeline for that is going to be dependent on kind of the proliferation, if you will, of NPU deployed endpoints that exist in environments. Mobile is going to be a new challenge too as well, because the compute may not be there to run a lot of those models locally in an efficient way. And so it's going to be a challenge, I think, we're going to encounter across multiple fronts right now. But on the back end, is supporting that with the data that looks at the changes that would be made.
Exactly.
For that is where we're using the telemetry across, my organization, across his organization, to still detect the attacks as they happen, while we wait for some of the compute power to catch up in a distributed model that we can use to catch those where they happen too as well.
Yeah, it's a good question though.
It's a great question.
Question. Question there.
Yeah, real quick. Last 2 years, how many ransomware attacks closed the customer completely?
Oh, I don't have a number. That's a really good question, though. We're not seeing any slowing down of ransomware. Well, let me rephrase that. Ransomware isn't going away anytime soon, but what we have seen an increase of over the past several years are double extortion campaigns, right? Where the adversaries get onto your environment, they actually steal your data, and then they try to run the ransomware. And the reason they've done this is because of tools like CrowdStrike, or there's sometimes the ransomware itself isn't successful because there's some more advanced endpoint protection technology out there. And so they want to increase their chances of getting paid out. And so what they'll do is they'll target an organization, look for things like what type of regulatory compliance that you're mandated by, and then they'll steal your data. And if they can't run your ransomware, then they'll say, hey, listen, we have your data and you are publicly traded and you're going to have to report this as a material breach to the SEC and you're going to be fined $10 million. For example, why don't you just pay us $3 million and we're going to make this problem go away, right? Mafioso-esque type of fashion. And so it's really more of adversaries there's low-hanging fruit of ransomware attacks that are successful, yes, right? But there's also an interesting, I don't want to call it an honor system, right? Where if you paid the ransom, they're going to decrypt your data, and they're doing that so that if they successfully ransom someone else, they want to actually have like a good Yelp review, if you will, of like, yeah, we actually unencrypted it, and here's our review cycle. We actually honored what we said we were going to do once we got paid. And so, ransomware isn't just there to be destructive, right? These groups want to monetize their efforts, and there's an entire very complex ecosystem of how these adversaries work with each other. We just actually published an episode on Ocular Spider that was released today. So smash that subscribe button and hit like and send it to your friends. But it actually talks about how these groups set up, there's access brokers that sell the identities, and then there's ransomware platforms that are out there now where you just simply subscribe to the service. You buy into using their ransomware, almost like it's a leasing agreement to run your campaign. It's very complex and it's very effective. And so, there's numbers that we can share with you on what has been impacting organizations in terms of operational impact versus extortion campaigns that are probably more successful.
And I think specifically you were asking if it shut down a company completely.
Yeah.
Like
it honestly, it varies. I mean,
like permanently, like they went bankrupt, they're out of business. I don't know that I've seen a company ever go completely bankrupt from an attack.
Yeah.
I have seen an entire leadership team swapped out. I've seen losses of over $50 million in 1 week, and more complex attacks that had a broader scale, where I've seen a retail organization lose close to $1 billion total loss with all the fines, with the outages and downtime associated with it.
Seen hospitals go all paper, right? I've seen hospitals go completely all paper, right?
Yeah, I've seen loss of life in a healthcare organization for a hospital ambulance dispatch system being shut down from ransomware, and they couldn't get an ambulance routed. So I've seen some pretty severe consequences. I don't know that I can think of an example where a business was fully shut down or went bankrupt from a ransomware attack.
Yeah. Good question, though.
I think we got time. We can take one more.
I think there's one down there.
And then we'll go back.
Yeah.
There was a hand down there.
Yep. So the recent report from CrowdStrike was, 442%, I believe, increase in phishing. Can you both talk about the things you can do as an organization to address that, both from a people, process, and technology standpoint?
Yeah, I'll give it okay. This is a fun one. I would say I just had a meeting yesterday about this. It's the phishing is always going to be there, right? You can't necessarily stop the person from calling, but I would say like awareness training on usually what happens is the phone call comes in and then the adversary asks the user to do something, and usually that something is, hey, download this remote management tool or go to like logme123 so I can fix something, right, on your endpoint. I think first and foremost, standardizing on like 1 or 2 remote management tools is so important. I can't tell you the amount of companies I meet where I'm like, how many remote management tools or RMM tools do you have? And they're like, we have like 5 or 6, but we're trying to whittle that down. I'm like, that 5 or 6 is like way too much, quite frankly.
It's attack surface.
That's an attack surface, absolutely. Because your employees don't even know what's legitimate now. And so that's very confusing for the end user experience to understand, well, here's another tool, because I'm so used to these tools changing, or someone in help desk calling me and asking me to do one versus the other. And so I think that culturally, that needs to be changed by standardizing and educating your employees that we have one remote management tool, and this is it. And if you ever get a phone call from someone that's asking you to do something else, hang up and call the help desk directly, right? And then ask if someone did call you. So I think it's educating first and foremost that you don't necessarily always have to say yes to the help desk person. You can always hang up and call back, right?
Yeah. We just did a consulting engagement with a financial services organization. They had been attacked. They had been compromised, and the attacker was using phishing to go after branch offices specifically. And so they changed the help desk procedures that anytime there was an outbound call, that always comes as a request to call back in
Love that.
to the standard help desk line, never changing the number if anybody asks differently. And they trained the whole organization to that. We will call you, and then you will return the call with your ticket number to the help desk line that is published on our intranet site that everybody knows. And that is the only way you should ever change or allow anybody to have access to your system. That way it was always, well, I hear you. I understand I need to do this thing. I'm going to call back by the process. And anybody that didn't want to do that, they knew immediately that was violating something. So it was a good way to put in a way of multi-factor authentication, if you will, into the process itself.
Love that. Awesome.
So we're at time up. And so thank you guys so much for the questions and for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.